The world remembers wars, kings, plagues, and empires, but it rarely remembers the quiet, invisible forces that reshape civilizations from the inside. And the greatest of these silent forces is inflation, not the modern kind that nudges grocery prices upward, but the kind that rewires entire continents, destroys currencies, erases wealth, collapses governments, and turns everyday life into a slow-motion disaster. And nowhere in history did this invisible monster strike harder than in the 1500s and 1600s, during the event historians call the Price Revolution, a century-long economic upheaval so vast and so destructive that it changed the fate of Europe, toppled empires, rewrote social classes, fueled wars, bankrupted nations, ignited revolts, and left a scar that still shapes modern economics. Yet almost no one today can describe what happened or why it happened because it unfolded not like an explosion, but like rising floodwater, inch by inch, year by year, until one day people looked around and realized the entire world they depended on had quietly drowned. And to understand why this happened, you have to go back to the moment when Europe, recovering from the medieval era and entering the dawn of global exploration, suddenly found itself connected to a world it didn't know existed. Because when Spanish ships returned from the Americas carrying unimaginable quantities of gold and silver, treasure on a scale Europe had never seen, they didn't merely enrich a handful of kings or merchants. They detonated an economic chain reaction that would ripple through every market, every village, every kingdom, every class, because the sudden, uncontrollable surge of precious metals into Europe acted like a financial supernova, blasting apart the delicate balance between money supply, wages, prices, and production. And Europe, completely unprepared for such a shock, responded the way all economies respond when flooded with new money. Prices surged upward, wages lagged behind, currencies destabilized, and the poor, as always, suffered first and suffered worst. And this upward pressure on prices wasn't a brief spike or a temporary disruption, but a relentless, generational upheaval that lasted more than a century. A slow-motion catastrophe that nobody understood at the time because the very concept of inflation barely existed. And so as the cost of bread doubled and tripled, as rents soared, as governments found their treasuries drained of purchasing power, people searched for explanations. Some blamed greedy merchants, some blamed hoarding, some blamed divine punishment, but almost no one understood the real cause: the sheer quantity of gold and silver being dragged across the Atlantic. Because the galleons kept coming, and as they came, Spain, the empire that initiated the extraction, became paradoxically weaker, not stronger, for Spain believed that wealth meant precious metal, that treasure equaled prosperity, that the crown could buy power infinitely as long as gold flowed. But as gold came in, prices rose in Spain faster than anywhere else, making Spanish goods uncompetitive, hollowing out domestic industries, collapsing agriculture, and leaving Spain dependent on imports, which meant the gold that poured in went straight back out again, flowing to France, Italy, the Low Countries, and beyond, fueling inflation everywhere it landed, turning all of Europe into an overheating economic furnace. And as the precious metals spread outward, kings and governments who depended on fixed revenues suddenly found themselves unable to pay armies, unable to supply courts, unable to service debts, leading to tax hikes, forced loans, currency manipulation, and ultimately sovereign defaults, as Venice, France, Spain, and even local principalities found themselves strangled by financial pressure, while the wealthy elites who owned land, collected rents, and controlled grain markets saw their fortunes balloon because inflation always rewards those who own assets, while laborers, soldiers, artisans, and peasants, whose wages barely moved, slipped into deeper and deeper poverty, widening the gulf between rich and poor to a degree Europe had not seen since antiquity. And this widening inequality ignited unrest, revolts, peasant uprisings, and social breakdowns across England, Germany, France, and the Spanish Netherlands, fueling political instability that helped set the stage for decades of religious wars, territorial conflicts, and the reshaping of monarchies themselves, because governments drowning in inflation became desperate for revenue, desperate for control, desperate to impose order on populations increasingly unable to afford the basics of life. And meanwhile, the powerful merchant banking families of Europe, in Genoa, in Antwerp, in Amsterdam, exploited the chaos, extending credit to kings and profiting endlessly from the volatility the price revolution unleashed, turning finance into a weapon and transforming Europe's economic structure forever. Because once money itself becomes unstable, the people who control credit become more powerful than the people who control territory. And that shift, invisible to most, was the spark that ignited the rise of the modern financial world. Yet even as Europe reeled under this century-long price surge, most people didn't understand that they were living through a revolution, didn't understand that the world they inherited would not resemble the world they passed on to their children, didn't understand that the inflation they experienced wasn't a temporary hardship, but a structural transformation driven by globalized money for the first time in human history. And the irony, the tragedy, the unforgettable lesson of the price revolution is that it wasn't caused by scarcity, but by abundance, not by poverty, but by too much wealth, too much gold, too much silver, too much money created too quickly, a pattern humanity would repeat again and again in centuries to come as nations printed currency, inflated debt, weaponized credit, and mistook the appearance of wealth for the substance of it. And as the price revolution burned across Europe, generation after generation woke to find money meant less, effort earned less, and life cost more, pushing entire populations into new economic realities they neither chose nor understood, until eventually the crisis reached its peak, when inflation transformed from a creeping pressure into a civilizational weight that warped the political order itself, pushing states toward authoritarian controls, economic experimentation, and desperate attempts to freeze prices, regulate markets, and control trade. But none of it worked. None of it could stop the tidal wave unleashed by the flood of bullion. Because once an economy begins spiraling under a century of price pressure, the momentum becomes unstoppable. And Europe, exhausted, transformed, and fractured, entered a new era in which the old medieval order, based on fixed rents and stable money, finally collapsed under the realization that the world had changed forever, that gold was no longer value but volatility, that the age of stable prices was gone, and that the modern age, with its rising costs, shifting fortunes, and volatile currencies, had arrived whether anyone wanted it or not, and the story of how that transition reshaped Europe. So quietly under the weight of new wealth entering their bloodstream that when the backlash finally came, when prices began rising faster than wages, when governments found themselves hopelessly addicted to easy silver, when merchants complained that the coins they received this year bought far less than they did the year before, most people did not blame the flood of bullion at all, but instead blamed foreigners, merchants, corrupt officials, bad harvests, witchcraft, fate, God, anything except the real culprit, the relentless expansion of Europe's money supply, which had never before been altered so violently and so suddenly. And the proof was everywhere, so stark that even chroniclers at the time recognized that something unprecedented was unfolding, with England raising grain prices several 100%, with France experiencing food riots as ordinary laborers found themselves priced out of basic necessities, with Italy, once the center of banking stability, struggling to maintain value in its florins, ducats, and scudi as the purchasing power of every coin eroded year after year, a process that slowly rewired the social hierarchy by shrinking the wealth of traditional landlords and enriching dynamic traders who could take advantage of rising prices, which in turn destabilized centuries-old political orders that had rested on the assumption that land, not money, defined power. And this is what made the price revolution so transformative. It was not nominally a crisis of collapse, but a crisis of transformation, a long, rolling earthquake that shook Europe's foundations decade after decade until the old medieval world cracked apart and gave way to modernity, pushed not by kings or philosophers, but by a geological accident, a mineral glut, a river of foreign silver that Europe never knew how to stop, regulate, or even fully understand. And the irony is that the same empires that benefited most from the silver surge were also those destroyed by it, with Spain, flush with bullion, convinced it had achieved divine economic invulnerability, spending itself into state bankruptcy again and again, its debt costs exploding as inflation ate away at revenue streams, its nobility clinging to outdated feudal wealth models, while merchants in Amsterdam, Antwerp, and London quietly built the future with paper credit, joint stock companies, and early central banking tools designed specifically to manage the volatility that Spain pretended was not happening. And so the price revolution did not merely reshape markets, but reshaped power, shifting the global center of gravity northward as Dutch, English, and later French financial systems adapted to money that lost value over time, inventing interest, liquidity, futures markets, and the first theories of monetary policy, while Spain, the empire of gold, withered into irrelevance because it had no conceptual framework for a world where money was not stable, eternal, or rooted in divine metals, but was, instead, a fluid system, subject to flows, surges, and collapse. And perhaps the greatest tragedy of all is that the people living through this century-long upheaval did not know they were witnessing the birth of modern inflation. To them, life simply grew harder, prices simply rose, wages simply lagged, and no one understood that they were trapped inside the first large-scale monetary experiment in European history, one that would not be repeated until industrialization unleashed new waves of money creation. And yet in today's world, where central banks manipulate money supplies, where inflation is a constant political flashpoint, where asset bubbles form and burst in cycles, everything traces its lineage back to this moment. This one seismic event where wealth exploded too fast for the world to absorb, where nations mistook abundance for strength, where the greatest economic boom of the early modern era quietly planted the seeds for the first truly global inflationary crisis. And if there is one lesson, one brutal, enduring truth that the price revolution leaves us with, it is this: no empire, no nation, no institution is ever strong enough to survive a tidal wave of wealth if it does not understand the price of money itself.